that's kind of official, and then we have a second day of review that's technically a reading day, which is unofficial and it's just optional if you'd like to come. We will have pretty much the same kind of preparation that we had, not pretty much, it'll be exactly the same kind of preparation that we had for the midterm. So there will be some example. Hi.
Sorry, I'm late.
That's quite all right. You can move over here. I know you like being over on this side. It just... And I don't know what Taylor. If Taylor comes in, he'll be,
He'll be very uncomfortable. Much bigger than I am.
Yeah. The world is right. There will be a sample question or two on the web page. Those enterprising souls that have been digging around in the files and the folders have already found at least one, maybe two already on there. So, and I might just use one of those and make it a little more explicit and accessible for those of you who aren't rooting around in the files. Hello. I said vowels, you showed up. How about that new rail line we built out to your job, huh?
Can of food gets a free ride on Saturday, right?
That's right. The new tracks line out to the airport. Other people on my board were riding it yesterday. The employees were riding it. I couldn't, but I understand it all worked. The train stayed on the tracks, so that's good to hear. I'll also put up an expanded study guide, basically taking the same one that we had for the midterm and extending it. Again, there's an old version of that that's probably buried in one of those folders that you can find if you want. And the exam will be the same format. And again, 10 short answer questions and an essay. But you'll have a full 2 hours to answer. So that's what, an extra 40 minutes, something like that. The essay question will be a little bit more complex because you know more, right? And so, and you have more time to write. So the expectation is that you'll have more to say. There'll be more meat for you to kind of chew on for that question. Any questions about that process? Jen is already in a supplicant position. Yes?
And in the final exam, is cover all the content?
It would have to, yeah. Yeah. It would be really hard to just lop off the stuff that we've only done, because especially when you get into these essay questions, even if I don't intend to put something in there on, I don't know, nuisance, it'll be there. You'll find it, and you'll want to write about it, right? So it's just easier. And it's actually, it's fairer to you, because these issues all tend to blend together and kind of intersect. And since you've already been tested on the first half of the semester, if it's comprehensive, then basically you're getting tested on that first half again. So it's easier if it's comprehensive. Make sense? Because if it's only stuff since the midterm, then all that stuff that you studied the first half won't help you on the final, right? So trust me, it's better this way. I don't think I'm making a convincing point here, but it's okay. Truth by assertion. Okay, so today we're going to talk about performance planning and zoning. On Tuesday we'll talk about transferring rights, principally transfer of development rights. You have some readings from your textbook on that subject, and also a link to an ordinance that's been, I'll see if I can call over to West Valley City and get an update on how well that ordinance is being used, or how effective it is. It's actually one of the oldest TDR ordinances in the state. They adopted theirs. It's been in operation for 10 years or more. And so they have a pretty long track record of using it. So I'll call John Jansen over there at Jensen and see if he can give me some information. And then we'll finish up Thursday next week talking about transit-oriented development, TODS, which in German, TOD means data. I always thought that was a bad brand, you know, when people, oh yeah, I'm in favor of TOD. Really? Wow. And you wear your hair in spikes too. And a certain kind of LEED certification, LEED ND, which is kind of a location-based approach to LEED. I think one of the reasons we have so few today is, isn't tomorrow's a special day for the entrance students, isn't it? Yeah. So good luck to everyone who's participating in that, and I'll be out out with the rubber chicken, rooting for you guys. So, okay. When we were talking about vertical consistency before, and when we addressed that subject, these many weeks ago, we talked about it in a pretty limited fashion, just in terms, basically, of plan to zone, or zoning ordinance. And I knew this would happen, so that's why I went to. What we're going to talk about today is extending that concept further up to state law. We have occasionally, throughout the semester, looked at the provisions of Utah state law, specifically the Land Use Development and Management Act, to see what requirements are placed on cities and counties in the planning and zoning functions. And if you will recall, when we've talked about LUTMA, as it's known, that it is a predominantly procedural statute, that the directives, the allocation, the delegation of power come with strings attached, and those strings basically are directing cities and counties to follow certain procedures when they engage in planning and zoning. There's very little in LUTMA that directs a specific substantive outcome. There are a couple things, and the kind of table of contents directives. There are certain, LUTMA specifies that general plans contain certain elements, minimum content. So there has to be a transportation element, there has to be a future land use element, there has to be a housing element. And one other thing, I can't remember, but I think there are only 4 things that have to be in there, and then they list a bunch of other things that can be in there. And of course, that list is not exhaustive, so you could put other things in there as well if you chose. But with the one exception of the housing element, there's nothing that is in state law that specifies a particular outcome. When it comes to transportation planning, the transportation element, you have to have one, and it has to cover roads and transit and bikes and peds and whatever. But it doesn't tell you what you have to do, what you have to achieve. It doesn't specify any level of service or any particular vision. What we're going to talk about today are some states that have those kinds of expectations, that do require certain outcomes, that planning, that the delegation of authority to plan and zone comes with not just procedural strings attached, but also substantive strings. That these plans and these zoning ordinances must achieve some specified end goals that are articulated by the state. It says here in the introduction to your reading that I love it when I read about the Oregon system. Of course, I know that system inside and out, or at least inside and out as it existed up until the moment I left the state. And of course, I have a vested interest in keeping track of what they've been up to since then, and I do look in on them pretty regularly. But when I read something like this, it's great gratifying, because I get to go through and say, oh, right there, second sentence, an error. They got it completely wrong. And of course, I just feel so superior. That's just such a great thing to find. And this is a real textbook. This is, by the way, this is taken, photocopied, and scanned from the other major casebook in land use law. Basically, if you're teaching a class in land use law in the United States, you either have the book that you guys are using or the book that this one excerpt came from. There are only two. There are some other minor ones, but there are two major ones. And so this is a book that's used all over the country in major law schools, and I look at it, wrong. But the feeling of satisfaction is followed very quickly by this little voice in the back of my head that says, you know what? You do this kind of writing too. You write about other people's programs and other state regulations and other planning systems in other parts of the country where you've never lived and you've never practiced, and you know what you know from one afternoon's reading of materials. So what do you think the odds are that you got what you wrote and got published by, the Journal of the American Planning Association? What are the odds that you got it exactly right? And so the feeling of superiority is followed by a reflection of humility. And you know what I take from that, and this is what the reason I'm telling this to you, is that when you write something like this that is going to be published or widely distributed, and it's about some other program that you're summarizing, and unless you have to do it on the fly, and I understand a lot of times you do, you have to write it and get it out because you're on some sort of crash deadline. If you're not on some sort of crash deadline, write into your schedule enough time to be able to send it to somebody who really knows the system. Make a contact in the city or the county or the state, through APA or other networks, to somebody who really knows the system, and so you can send your summary to that person and say, did I get it right? You'll save yourself a lot of headache on this. Okay, so here we are, first sentence. Oregon is also one of the only states in the United States which tried to mandate rather than permit local zoning. Really? No. Local zoning is mandated in a majority of the states. Most states require some sort of zoning, or they incentivize it to such a degree. In other words, there are some states where zoning is not mandated, but if you want to impose an impact fee system, you have to have a zoning ordinance. And so, and most municipalities, at least these days, need impact fees to make their budgets work. And so it's incentivized to such a degree that it basically is required. So that's kind of a weird statement. And then it lists 1969 as, or implies that 1969 is the date that Oregon's planning system got started. And there were some precursors that did come in 1969, but the big moment came in 1973 when Senate Bill 100 was adopted, and the legislation did a whole bunch of different things, but it created a new state agency, the Land Conservation and Development Commission, the members of which were to be appointed by the governor and confirmed by the Senate, and a department full of professional planners to support the commission, the Department of Land Conservation and Development, DLCD. And it gave that agency the authority to adopt statewide planning goals that would have the force of law. that would be enforceable. It didn't specify what those goals should be. It kind of sketched a couple of topics, but it pretty much delegated to the agency the task of articulating the subjects and the content of what the goals should be. And then LCDC and the staff went around the state and had, I don't know, dozens, scores of public hearings to get public feedback and input on what the goals should be. Chris Nelson, maybe you know, from our department, was at that time the planning director in one of Oregon's counties, in Columbia County. And he was the planning director when these hearings were going on. And he reports Columbia County, if you're not familiar with the Oregon geography, is the first county towards the northwest, downriver from the Portland metro area. It is, I want to say Hick. That's probably not, it's not PC, it's Hick. But I think a lot of people, what's that?
Rural?
Yes, it is rural. Its politics are, I wouldn't say, very liberal. It's pretty conservative. They, it was in Columbia County that they had to bring out the sheriff to track people down for weapons at these hearings.
Sounds like my town.
Yeah. So if you're going into planning, it is it's kind of a contact sport, full contact sport. At any rate, these hearings were contentious, but the agency went around the state and got feedback, and they came up with 19 different goals. Statewide planning goals. Okay, I've done this before. Let's see if I can do it. It's been a while now. Goal 1 is citizen involvement. Oh no, yes, goal 1 is citizen involvement. Goal 2 is land use planning. Goal 3 is agricultural lands. Goal 4 is forest lands. Goal 5 is natural resources. Goal 6 is air and water. Goal 7, what is goal 7? Goal 8 is recreation. Goal 9 is economic development. Goal 10 is housing. Goal 11 is public facilities. Goal 12 is transportation. 13 is energy. 14 is urbanization. 15 is the Greenway, the Willamette Valley Greenway, and then 16 through 19 are the coastal goals, and I can't keep those straight because I didn't work in coastal issues, except for the Stevens case, very much. How did I do? I do right? I think I did. Very well. Okay. Oh, natural hazards. Goal 7 is natural hazards. Okay. Well, yeah, I got the best one. And the content of these goals are very general. So let's get into the case here, and this will give us at least a context to talk about the rest of the system. Volunteers, yeah, great, I'll go. So first of all, Thousand Friends of Oregon versus LCDC, the state land use agency. So Thousand Friends is a nonprofit organization. It was modeled after the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund. As a nonprofit law firm. And it was instituted, this is interesting, it was instituted, the rest of it's not interesting, but this is, it was instituted in part by the governor. Governor Tom McCall, we were talking about last time, when a state takes the step that Oregon has and that the 15, 16 other states that have done similar things, when a state takes that kind of step, it's almost always at the behest of a governor who provides leadership and does the really heavy arm lifting or arm twisting, that's it, to get the political ducks in a row to pass the legislation. So Tom McCall was a Republican. I like him already. Yeah. Rural Republican from Prineville in central Oregon. And yet he was pro-government regulation of private land. Stuff. Well, you maybe have heard the phrase, only Nixon could go to China, right? This system would not have been adopted by the Oregon legislature if it had been promoted primarily by a Portland Democrat. The fact that it was a rural Republican, populist-oriented Republican, is what really made the difference. And then he had, he was a very colorful guy. He had been a broadcaster, sports broadcaster before, and so he knew how to work a crowd. And he had this great turn of phrase. And he was concerned about the landscape, and he used the landscape as a really a kind of a conservative way of understanding place and community and the importance of maintaining the landscape to a largely agricultural tradition and forest-based economy. The number one and number two contributors to Oregon's economy continue to be agriculture and forestry. And he saw these mainly outsiders moving into the state, mainly from California, and there's a little bit of xenophobia here that he used to his political advantage. There's one thing that Oregons all agree on: they don't like Californians. And so he would go around and do these stump speeches talking about sagebrush subdivisions and coastal condominium and the ravenous rampage of suburbanization across the heart of the Willamette Valley, and people, whoa! And I wrote a speech once using some of his material and delivered it at a conference in England, in Newcastle, for the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, and submitted the speech in advance of my, a couple weeks before I arrived at the conference. And I got to the conference site, and one of the city councilors in Newcastle took me aside and said, "You guys are a smashing speech, but I have to tell you that it caused quite a stir in the typing pool." I said, "Why is that?" He says, "Well, I had one of the subheadings in my talk had used this quote: sagebrush subdivisions and coastal condominium." He says, "Well, here in Great Britain, we don't refer to ownership apartments as condos, we refer to them as flats. And condominia is actually the name of a certain chain of stores that sell adult equipment." Condomania. Yeah. So, okay. I don't think that's what Tom Cole had in mind. But it got a lot of people to show up to my talk.
Something got lost in translation.
Yeah, exactly. So McCall was able to get all these people together to pass this legislation, but he was concerned, and this is true to kind of the Republican ideals. He was concerned about government's ability to actually pull it off, and that if you left this task just to government, it would its implementation would be compromised. So he helped found this nonprofit organization whose charge it was to nip at the heels of local government, in particular state government too, and to ensure robust implementation. So, hence 1,000 Friends versus LCDC. When I interviewed for my job at 1,000 Friends, it was the year that this case came down, 1988. And before I went to the interview, I decided I should read up a little bit on the organization. I had no idea. And so I did a Westlaw search for all case names with 1,000 Friends of Oregon in the title. And the search shut down. This was back in the 80s, so it was pretty crude search engine. The search shut down after 100. And the organization had been around for about 15 years then. And so I started reading it. And they were all LCDC, or 1,000 Friends versus LCDC. 1,000 Friends versus LCDC. They have all these parentheses. Lane County, in this case. Okay, so Craig the opinion here is kind of complex. It spends an awful lot of time focusing on stuff that mainly lawyers are concerned with, having to do with deference to agency interpretation and so forth. What did you take from this? What seemed to grab your attention and had meaning for you?
Well, in summary of the case at whole, or just the...
Sure, let's start there.
Basically, it's the competing goals of Goal 3 and Goal 4 with respect to Lane County's plan that they submitted that was approved, and allowing for, I believe, dwellings on 10 acres of land that were accessory and necessary, and essentially, I guess, yeah, it was complex. I couldn't gather quite what, in total, what Thousand Friends was arguing, but essentially, we're remanding some, affirmed some, and then reversed some from the decision.
It was a stunning victory. When I showed up for my interview, they were still doing their little victory dance. But actually, they were doing that a lot. We won. Our win rate was over 80%. Was what? Over 80%. And we were good. We were really good. Well, and our opponents were really bad. Sometimes you just look at it and say, really? You really think that's going to fly? But anyway. So you take from this not only what we were just talking about, that we have state laws in the case of statewide planning goals that provide substantive standards that are mandatory on local government plans, and that incidentally, another element of the system that wasn't really focused on was the requirement that zoning ordinances have to be consistent with plans. So zoning ordinances have to be consistent with plans, plans have to be consistent with the goals and other state laws. And the fact that we're reading about this in a court opinion tells you that there is an enforcement mechanism, right? This is one of the problems with Utah's law. We do have substantive requirements in one area having to do with affordable housing. LUDMA, if you read it through, has a section in there requiring local governments to do an assessment of what they call moderately priced housing to determine whether there is an adequate supply to meet demand of moderately priced housing within the jurisdiction, and if there is not, to adopt plan elements and implementing zoning regulations to correct that deficiency. And there's no way to enforce it. Or there are only indirect and very clumsy ways of enforcing it. In the Oregon system, there's this whole process called acknowledgement, which is an odd word. I don't think they wanted to use approve or certify or other kind of normal English words. They use this acknowledgement. Oh yes, I acknowledge you. But what the acknowledgement process was, and they still use it, is this determination through a formal governmental hearing process on whether the comprehensive plan and zoning ordinance being submitted by the local government do in fact comply with the statewide planning goals. LCDC basically said yes, and that was the subject of the lawsuit. That's what Thousand Friends was suing LCDC for, because they disagreed. They felt the plan was not accurate. Goal 4 is the forestry goal. How many people have been to Lane County? Anybody been? It's Eugene. This is where Eugene is, right? Oh, great, perfect. Is that where you're from?
No, I lived there for a couple years.
Great. Did you go to school there?
LES Mission, actually.
Oh, really? In Eugene?
I've lived in Bonita and Cottage Grove and
Wow.
down south in Ashland, like all all over.
All the way down to Ashland?
All the way down that one. Yeah,
That's a big addition area.
yeah.
That's huge. Roseburg and Rogue Valley and all that.
Yeah, there's not too many people down there,
No, a lot of trees. A lot of trees. So Oregon's economy until very recently was dominated by the timber industry. And there was that, when the housing market sagged in the rest of the country, Oregon's economy always went into the tank. When I moved there in the early 80s, it was, there was a recession going on in the rest of the country. The housing market was dipping south, and Oregon's economy was, people were moving out of the state. When I was moving in. So forest, that's why goal 4 figures prominently here, because it is the forestry goal. And you have it quoted here in the very long footnote number 1. Goal 4 seeks to conserve forest lands for forest use, and then we have definitions. Forest lands are da-da-da-da, forest uses are da-da-da-da. Any listing of houses there? Any mention of houses?
Not in those goals, no.
No, not the goal language. And so this is what the fight. These are what the fights are usually about: is the construction of houses on farmland, on forest lands, out in the rural areas. The concern shared, interestingly, by the Oregon Forest Industries Council, OFIC, is you would think these are the big timber companies, usually not the small ones. These are the big timber operators, so the Georgia Pacifics, and so forth. These are not liberal, progressive, Democrat. These are really pretty staunch conservative people, but they were our number 1 ally. Why? If you're going out to harvest timber, what's the last thing you want to have?
Competition.
You don't want to have people out there. You don't want to have people living in houses next door because they're the people who are going to sue you and try to stop the timber operation. And you also, even if you're not going out there to harvest timber, you don't want them out there. Why? Because houses in the forest are the number 1 source for forest fires. And so, so it was this weird situation with very odd bedfellows. Here's this environmental group, very, very
Save the trees, we can chop them down.
Well, we said forest practices. I mean, this is called, for those of you who are interested in doing nonprofit work, there is a lesson to be learned from the Oregon model of nonprofit activism, because there were so many different nonprofit organizations that you could kind of split up the issues. In a lot of states, you've got just 1 or 2 dominant environmental organizations, and they try to cover everything, soup to nuts. And what it does is it creates, there's always something on your agenda. If you're in one of these organizations, there's always something on your agenda that is going to piss off a potential ally, right? But if you have more of a boutique kind of slicing of the subject matter, the way that Oregon was able to do, because there were so many different environmental organizations. 1,000 Friends, our job was just to keep the land intact, keep it from being developed, the rural lands from being developed improperly. And what happened on those rural lands when it came to forest practices, that's another organization, or farm practices, that's another organization. We just want to keep the houses off. And because we were able to focus just on that agenda, we were actually, the Farm Bureau, Oregon Farm Bureau, and the Oregon Forest Industries Council were our 2 biggest allies. In the case of the Forest Industries Council, they kept our alliance. They wouldn't admit to it because it was just a little too much for them. But the Farm Bureau, we'd go down and lobby at the state legislature all the time for the Farm Bureau, and they were our clients in litigation occasionally. And that, when I tell people in other states about that, really? Because Farm Bureaus are also not known for being terribly progressive. So, so the gist of this here is the county wants to do what with the forest lands.
We basically want to allow for dwellings on there for the management of forest uses. And basically, they to be accessory and necessary, but there's no dwelling or mobile home to be used for that management.
Yeah, and what they were trying to do is they were trying to create an as of right permitting system for houses on the forest lands. And basically, instead of having an individualized determination, a conditional use permit process, where you would go through and assess on a case-by-case basis whether a house was necessary and accessory to forest use. Basically, it was a checkoff kind of system, and if you submitted a forest management plan, you got a house. Was pretty much it. And if that system had gone into place, it would have been a bonanza for environmental planning consulting firms that create forest management plans, because people would submit those and just to get a house, and they wouldn't manage the forest. Anybody ever been engaged in forestry, commercial forestry, or had family members engaged in it? You don't need to live on the land to manage it for forest product, really ever. It's not like dairy farming, where you do kind of need to be there where the cows are.
You don't have to pick up the pine cones and put them in the
No. And it's it's not like sheep farming or or sheep ranching or anything like that, where you're dealing with animals and you need to be there kind of 24/7 to take care of animal needs. Trees, they pretty much kind of take care of themselves, and if you go through and do management activities once every 5 years, because we're dealing with at least in the most productive lands, a growth cycle that's at least 40 years long, 2 generations, from sapling to harvest. And so, coming through and thinning about every 5 years is about all you need to do. So, the need for having a house out there is like, yeah, it was kind of a ruse. You're not really managing this forest. You've got a cabin.
So Lane County, so LCDC, aren't they conservative? I mean, I would think that here's this, land conservation group. Hey, you're in charge of protecting us, but you're having all these lawsuits. Maybe you're not so conservative?
Well, yeah, LCDC this was Tom McCall's, the governor's concern, is that if it just was up to government, that they would be too accommodating. And we talked last time about the politics and the difficult politics of planning, especially if you're planning in a way that is trying to promote development in certain areas and conserve other areas. Because the economic benefits of that kind of system are not distributed equally. And you have a lot of elected officials at the local government level, and certainly at the county level, and at the state level, that come from rural districts. They're mainly resource-based. And yeah, they appreciate the farm gate sales and the tax receipts that come from that, and from the jobs that are associated with the timber industry. Of course, those are crucially important, but they also want to get other kinds of economic development going. And so then you get this system in place that basically says, okay, cities get to say yes to development, and counties get to say no to development. Well, that's a lot of fun, and it creates this really kind of tense situation. And so LCDC is they're a creature of the state legislature, and the state legislature has an awful lot of people there that are very conservative from rural districts who don't like the system. And so they have to get their budget approved every biennium. And so they tended to be a little bit more cautious. And so it was our job, and you couldn't blame them, right? We didn't, vilify them, well, not too much, for being that cautious. We felt like it was our job to provide framing of the political spectrum. I mean, if you're engaged in this kind of activity, you always want to have somebody that's more radical than you, right? Especially if you're in government. If you're in a situation and you're trying to institute a program like this, you can't be the most liberal voice in the discussion, because if you are, you're kind of hanging out there by yourself. You need somebody who's pushing you from the left as much as you need somebody that's pushing you from the right. And so we kind of felt like that was our job. And we'd like to do that, Commissioner Jones, but those 1,000 friends, they have that 80% winning record. If we do that, they're just going to come and sue us, and we'll all hold attorney fees. So that was helpful. Okay, so we've got goal 4 that is there to conserve forest lands for forest use. Goal 3, which does the same thing for farm use. In the end, the court doesn't buy LCDC's approval of the county's proposal. Right? What else did you take from this?
Well, the blending of the two zones, I guess, the randomly done between farm use and the forest use, is that you couldn't have the same uses for both. In that area that was hard to define between the two.
Yeah, the system is a little artificial, because there are, areas that were kind of both or neither. And what do you do with those lands? An awful lot of this case, you think, well, this case goes on for a number of pages, but this is maybe only 20% of the opinion. There's a lot more to this. And when I took the job at Thousand Friends, one of my early tasks was to deal with remand from this opinion. And one of my task, when I would start reading through this, it's like, oh yeah, where are they going to get to my issue? They didn't get to it. It's just so pleased. But there were all these areas where they talk, and there's a reference to it of what we call slop zones, where they were rural lands, but they were already impacted by houses that had already been developed. And so the question was whether they were still appropriate for zoning these very restricted zones for farming and forestry. And if they weren't, then how do you deal with them? They were rural residential, is what it was. And the county had a very broad brush approach to classifying those lands. And we successfully challenged that system and required them to go back through property by property and justify each one of those designations. And it was my job as the new attorney in the office with no seniority, and to go through and monitor and comment on every parcel. And this is for a very large county. And the 3 reading binders, when they were all stacked up, were about this high, and we had to comment on every one of those properties. And every lawyer's got a story like this. I have several, but of just barely meeting the deadline. Our comments on the remand had to be at the LCDC office in Salem, which is an hour drive from Portland, by 5 o'clock on this specified day. I'd been up for 2 days solid, 2 nights solid, 3 days, trying to finish these comments, and it was 4:15 when the last page came out of the printer. And so we boxed everything up and got into somebody's VW Rabbit and drove like, you know what, down to Salem. There was I think there was a traffic jam. There was I don't know, truck had turned over, or some sort of accident, and you know the highway was completely locked. We drove on the median. Zoom! And we knew we were still not going to make it, so we had somebody from our office call down to the DLCD office at 5 minutes to 5 and talk to Carol. Carol was the receptionist. She was the person who would lock the front door, right, at 5. And so we got one of our more chatty employees to call down, and because we knew everybody in the staff, right? Because we're doing stuff, we sue them all the time, but we were doing stuff cooperating. And so and so we got somebody to call down and talk to Carol. Oh, tell me, what's happening with your grandkids and blah blah blah, and got her engaged and just kept talking, and now it's about 10 after 5, and Carol says, "Oh look, here comes Keith coming up the steps. Oh, okay, bye." Got our stuff in. It was crazy. What do you take from this? Well, the reason we read this, and it is complex, and there's a lot of detail here, and I don't expect you to understand all that or to keep track of it. What I wanted you to do is to see a system where we have this kind of vertical consistency, where the state says we have legitimate concerns and interests that need to be protected through this planning process. And most of them have come back to economics. Like I said, the primary concern here was protecting the land base to protect the state's economy. And because the sense was that willy-nilly real estate development will provide short-term gains, but at the expense of long-term economic stability. And so the state doesn't tell the local government exactly what to do when it comes to planning and zoning, but it tells the local government what the outcome is that they want to achieve. And so that's why I refer to this, and others do too, as performance-based planning, performance-based zoning. Do follow the approach that best suits your circumstance in your jurisdiction. But we want you to achieve this end result. And so, technically speaking, the only language that is the goal language are these little phrases, and technically speaking, these are the only ones that are legally enforceable. They're not even full sentences. Go forward to conserve forest lands for forest uses. That is the goal. That's the totality of the goal, and that's the only part that is legally enforceable for agricultural lands. To preserve and maintain agricultural lands, period. Now, all the other stuff, we have all this other language here, is interpretation, the agency's interpretation of that goal language. But that is not the goal itself, and the interpretation the court may or may not follow. And I think there's a lot of discussion in this opinion about deferring to the degree to which the court should defer to the agency's interpretation of its own rule. But it's the goals language itself. So this is, a lot of people have lambasted the Oregon program for being too directive and being top-down. But if you look at it, it's actually not. It just says, here are the state's interests we want you to achieve when you do your planning and zoning, and we'll have some sort of system for assessing how well you do. How well has the system worked? Well, in 1973, when the Senate Bill 100 was adopted, there were 16 million acres. Well, actually, it was 1975 after Goal 3 and Goal 4 were adopted. There were 16 million acres in the state zoned for farm use and 8 million acres zoned for forest use. Today, There are 15.5 million acres zoned for farm use, and I think there are now 9 million acres for forest use. It's actually, the forest zoning has increased. And this is, you know, how 30 years down, 40 years down the road since the system was created. That's astounding. That is really astounding. So there are lots of problems with the system. No system is going to be perfect, but when you look at it just from that perspective, it's like, wow, okay, they set up to preserve the land base, and they pretty much did. Now, all those other goals have similar kinds of statements attached to them. The only other one that I would point out to you is Goal 14, urbanization. This is the goal that requires every municipality in the state to have an urban growth boundary. And this was referenced in the article that we read last time on the Maryland priority funding areas. Urban growth boundaries are regulatory instruments that designate what lands are to be developed at urban densities and what lands are to be preserved for rural uses. And they are designed, they're kind of a presumption. If you're inside the urban growth boundary, if the land is inside the urban growth boundary, the presumption is that it is available for development. If it's outside the urban growth boundary, the presumption is that it's being protected for resource purposes. But there are ways of overcoming those presumptions. There are other state laws that require urban growth boundaries to contain an adequate supply of land for future growth of various kinds, residential, commercial, industrial, etc. And it's been, I think it's probably one of the more successful parts of the system. This combined with forest and farming and other resource zoning. If you look at the kind of middling success of Maryland's program, which is more or less an incentive-based program, I think one of the conclusions I come back to is incentives are nice. The regulations, if you can make it work, regulations combined with incentives is probably a better approach. But that's just my take. If you want more on this, of course, take Chris Nelson's urban growth management class because he goes into all this stuff in great detail. Now, what I'd like to do is conclude early and allow those of you who are interested in going down to hear Christine Richmond do her talk tonight to go and do so. I would encourage you to do it. She's a really good presenter. She's one of our adjunct professors, and she teaches a great class in economic development, and I know that's an interest for many of you. So her talk is down at the Leonardo, and it starts in 25 minutes. Questions? Great. Have a great weekend, and we'll get together again on Tuesday.